video that was posted to the Garden Club's Facebook page, where basically with the help of my 8-year-old daughter, we did a who, why, when, where, how about soil testing. And there's a little bit of a spiel about how you get to the point that I'm going to pick up on now. So if you wanted to check for that video to kind of backfill later on, you're certainly welcome to do that. This part 2 that I'm going to be talking about today, it really answers the question, the what question, which is the one that was not in part 1. So it's really talking about what in terms of what are our results that we got from Old Town Hall. But before we get there, what can you expect to get when you get soil test results back? What does all the gibberish that might look like gibberish to you, what does it all mean? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that first. Just to backtrack a spec, as you know, in a new initiative, Old Town Hall, there's been a movement, I guess, within the Garden Club to really try to revitalize that space and make the surrounding area even more beautiful. And so Jennifer has been instrumental in leading the charge there, and it's been divided into 7 different sections. And we tested these sections in November. And the results came back from the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, if that's in New Haven. And we picked this one because this one's free. So, if it's free, it's for me. I like free. The only difference really that would be important potentially to us is that there's no lead testing in the one that we got. If we were concerned about lead, say we were putting in a playground, or we were going to be growing vegetables that we're going to be eating those vegetables, of course, in those circumstances, or if, little kids are going to be running around, they're younger than 6. That's where you get into your lead poisoning issues that way. But we figured we really didn't need to do that because we aren't going to be having any kind of playground, and we're not going to be consuming any of the things that are growing on that property. So when we got back this soil test, the results, they're based on something called the Morgan soil test. It's actually pretty interesting. 50 years ago, this man, Dr. Morgan, he devised the first test for quickly estimating soil fertility and excesses and deficiencies that appear in the soil. And our results then are based off this standard that he set up. And it's kind of neat that we sent for our results, at the same place where he used to work. We actually developed this test that's used worldwide. I'm going to talk a lot about some fairly technical words, and I'm going to talk a little bit about if there's an excess or a deficiency with some of these nutrients, what that might look like and how that might manifest itself in the plant. But so much of what I'm saying, you can get that stuff by looking at the 2 websites for 2 different soil testing places that I recommend. I'll get to that in a second. And also when you get your results back, you get an explanation with your results. So much of what I'm saying, there's no need to, frantically take any notes or anything like that. I mean, certainly welcome to, but you can find this information in those locations. So let me see, I'm going to try to shift to share my screen here where I have a 10-slide PowerPoint. Does everybody see that?
No.
No. Do you see it now?
No.
No.
Maybe I need to switch.
Oh, wait a minute, here we go. No, this is it.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
You see it now?
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome. Now, can you still see me or no?
No.
Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to know, basically, because I'm going to be ducking back in and out here and there. So I wanted to get a sense from you all, if I have to duck in and duck out. Anyway, I talked about 2 websites that I think are great resources for soil testing in this area. And this is the one that we used for our Old Town Hall site. I also wrote down, when you get to this web address that's at the top, these are the links that you're going to click on, and it's going to tell you everything that you need to know and pretty much everything I'm saying in this presentation. And this is exciting because it's free, so that's wonderful. So that's the first website or institution, I guess I'd recommend, the CAES, the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, for doing soil testing. Now the second one Need to figure out how to move this forward. Here we go. This is another one that's very good. And if you were interested for whatever reason in making sure that you could include a lead test in your soil testing, I would go with this one. And you'll see once you type in that web address, there'll be right underneath that web address, basically a banner, and there'll be a banner that will talk about pricing, soil testing, frequently asked questions, fact sheets. So again, tons of information here, more than you need, but this is a great resource also for doing a soil test. And you can add on different tests. You know, if you were interested in testing for another, you know, salinity of your soil, say, you could add that test on. So it's sort of, you know, you kind of pick and choose what results you want back. But I'd say it's in the ballpark of about 20 or so. So since we ended up sending in 8 samples, 2 of our samples were from one of the 7 sites. We ended up getting 16 results back because we sent them in for what if we grow perennials here and what if we grow trees and shrubs here, because the recommendations are slightly different. So if we were to, you know, spend the money on it, would be about $200, you know, not a bad way to start by just going with the free route. So that's the other soil test. Move to the next.
Hey, Lindsay,
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Yep.
I did switch it, so now everyone should see you in the top corner.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that working for everybody?
Yes.
No.
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 In fact, I got the Zoom page. Now I got it. Yeah. Yeah.
If it seems really
See you.
critical that I duck back in, I can do it on my end. So it's
Right.
not a problem if you can't see me or if you
All
can.
right, well, I
Either
set
way
it up
works.
so you should see her. I do, I'm not sure.
Oh,
about
maybe,
everyone.
maybe there's a little thing here.
So when you get your soil test results back, you're going, especially if you get them back from this particular institution, the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, you're going to see different line items, and they're going to be soil texture, organic matter, pH, nitrate, nitrogen, ammonium, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. They're all going to be expressed as high, medium, or low, except for texture and organic matter. You're going to notice too that it'll be in the notes that the nutrients will only be classified as excessive when they might damage the plant. And there's also not been extensive enough, apparently, research done on how much of these micronutrients might be good for such a wide range of plants. So it's just really, they don't feel like, I guess, they have enough information to say, oh, you really should have this within this particular range. They're just much more concerned about whether or not it's excessive. And other nutrients, iron, copper, zinc, sulfur, boron, manganese, chlorine, these are also very important to the development and growth of plants. And that will also appear potentially on your test results when you get back. So soil texture basically is how much sand, silt, or clay is in your soil. And that's important because the amount of those different things together really influences the amount of water and the amount of nutrients that a soil can hold. So you can imagine a soil that's super sandy on one end and a soil that's super, you know, very much clay on the other end. And you can imagine the clay one, water is really gonna stick in the ground. It's gonna be much slower to drain. If you have such heavy clay soils, you run the risk, obviously, of the roots of the plant potentially rotting, you know, not being able to get any, get enough air because they're just sitting in water. And, you know, similarly, if you have the sandy soil, if it's just too sandy, all the water and the nutrients that are being carried with that water, it's just going to zip through the sand and not give the plant enough time to take it in. So you really want to find a happy medium there. Now, we ended up having in Old Town Hall, we have loamy sand, which is great. That's a very good sort of soil to be working with. There's a dozen or so classifications. Believe it or not, there is also sandy loam. So Old Town Hall Area 1 was sandy loam. Everything else is loamy sand. You know, the difference is really minor. It basically has to do with if you squeeze the soil and try to make a ribbon coming up through your thumb and forefinger, if you squeeze it and squeeze, so that you kind of make a tube extending upwards, at what point would that little ribbon essentially break. That's the difference between sandy loam and loamy sand, but you don't really need to know, specific details like that. But it just kind of, it always cracks me up, like, oh, do you have loamy sand or sandy loam? Like, it's really negligible for our purposes. So organic matter, that has to do with how much detritus, how much compost, how much peat moss. Those things in your soil are going to also influence the amount of water and nutrients that your soil is able to hold. So you want to have a good amount of organic matter because it's just going to create better soil structure, and there's going to be better retainment and also better drainage. So that's one reason why compost is recommended to be added to garden plots, because it improves the amount of organic matter and it improves that structure that's so critical. pH, maybe you remember this from high school chemistry class, but it's talking about the relative acidity or alkalinity of your soil. So the reason why this is important is because it affects the availability of plant nutrients. So in other words, if you have a soil that's too alkaline or a soil that's too acidic, plants aren't going to be able to absorb some of these nutrients. It just has to do with like ionic charges and all sorts of organic chemistry stuff that I don't really understand. But for the layperson, the reason why you need to know that is because it affects how much nutrients that plant will be able to absorb. So on a scale of 0 to 14, that's the pH scale. 7 is right in the middle. 7 is considered neutral. Above is alkaline, below is acidic. So for vegetable garden, like 6.0 to 7.0, like somewhere in there is really your sweet spot. Now, if you're, strictly a tomato farmer or strictly, a string bean person, it might be a little bit different. But generally speaking, for the hobby gardener growing a variety of vegetables, 6 to 7 is going to be good. Same with growing a variety of flowers.
Hey, Lindsay?
Yes.
Can I ask people to mute themselves? Because I hear some clicking and stuff.
Sure.
Someone's unloading their dishwasher.
Thanks.
Now, one exception that I'm going to say with the 6.0 to the 7.0, you probably know that azaleas, rhododendrons, blueberries, sometimes mountain laurel, your hydrangeas, if you want them to stay blue, those all need a little bit more acidic soil. So again, it's important. If you want to have, just an amazing azalea situation, you're not going to want to be at 7. You're going to definitely want to be lower. So you need to do a little research about what kind of pH is best for your plants. Connecticut soils generally trend acidic, oftentimes in the 4.5 to 5.5 range. So if we went out into the woods and just took a soil sample of a soil that's not been treated by humans in terms of trying to grow something on it, it would probably be pretty acidic. It's interesting because in the West, it's the opposite. The typical soil is very alkaline, and it just has to do with, the minerals that are available and also the amount of, acid rain, obviously like in the desert, you get a lot less acid rain than you would in, New England area or on the East Coast. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what nitrate and ammonium nitrogen are. And those are nutrients, and they're important for leaf growth and that beautiful rich green color that you want when you're growing plants. But if you have too much of that, you're not going to get flower, you're not going to get fruit. And if you have too little, you're going to see that your plants are going to oftentimes have really pale green or yellowish green leaves. The only difference that's really significant to us hobby gardeners is that the ammonium nitrogen is less easily leached out of the soil. It kind of hangs around longer, whereas the nitrate nitrogen tends to, if it doesn't get absorbed, it kind of disappears. So that's the real difference that you need to be aware of between those two kinds of nitrogen. Back on to phosphorus, that's the next item in our list. This is obviously represented by P in the elements, the table of elements. This nutrient can bind strongly in soil and thus can sometimes be unavailable. And so if you have too little phosphorus, you often have a poor root, fruit, or vegetable growth. And you can sometimes suspect that you have a potassium deficiency, or phosphorus deficiency rather, if your older leaves are turning a purplish shade. I want to take a moment here to just make a note about phosphorus. Too much phosphorus, and this is also gets to, you know, why you do soil tests anyway. You know, we want to have gorgeous gardens, but we also want to be good stewards of the land. And unfortunately, sometimes people apply fertilizers without really thinking or knowing what they're doing. And if you have too much phosphorus, and say you're treating your whole lawn and there's this excessive phosphorus, that's going to leach into the waterways and the watershed. It's going to make our way, you know, to ponds, rivers, ultimately the ocean. And this is where you see, you know, terrible algae, weed development in watershed areas. And that's one reason why having, you know, a gorgeous green grass lawn can get such a bad rap, because it does require massive amounts of this. And a lot of times people, in terms of trying to take care and make those lawns so gorgeous, they misapply some of these things. So, you know, nitrogen too much nitrogen in the waterways is really bad. As a matter of fact, fertilizers sold in Connecticut for taking care of grass, you're not even allowed to have added phosphorus in it. You're only allowed to have phosphorus in it when you're laying that sod down or putting down that grass seed. So I just want to kind of put a little bit of a plug and just kind of make you aware of how important it is once we get these recommendations, that it's really important to understand why you're doing what you're doing, because too much or too little is really bad, not only for the outcome in your garden, but very bad for the environment. And moving on to potassium, this is obviously represented by K in the periodic table. It's kind of too bad it's not potassium, because that would help me out. I get confused between key, you know, which is key. Is it the phosphorus? Is it the potassium? And that's going to be important to remember. NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, when we get to talking about fertilizers and percentages of these nutrients in fertilizers. But potassium can really quickly leach from soil, which is why it might need to be added. Too much, you can get soil salinity. This helps flowering, it helps disease resistance, it helps with cold hardiness and drought survival. So you can see all these nutrients have really important roles to play in ensuring that you have a healthy plant. Calcium, this is going to promote strong cells, strong root growth. If there isn't enough calcium, your plant might have curled leaves, dropped blossoms, or yellow edges around new leaves. Magnesium is very important because it's a critical element in chlorophyll, which we'll remember from high school biology is the green plant pigment that permits photosynthesis, for the absorption of light to be turned into energy for that to happen. So too much potassium, put too much nitrogen or potassium will make it really hard for a plant to absorb magnesium. And if a plant can't absorb magnesium, it means a plant can't effectively do photosynthesis, which clearly is a major problem for the plant, because without photosynthesis, the plant has no means to survive. So again, that's why the balance is really important. Not too much, not too little. It's like the Goldilocks scenario. You gotta, you know, kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about how you're using these amendments, how you're using these fertilizers. Now, there are also other micronutrients that are critical too. I've listed iron, copper, zinc, sulfur, boron, manganese, chlorine. These are harder tests, apparently, harder elements to test for because the tests are less reliable. But what people can do is they know that iron and copper and zinc, those deficiencies usually only happen when your pH is over 7, when it's more alkaline. So you can sort of assume that these might be issues if your pH is excessively one way or excessively another. I'm just gonna very quickly mention what deficiencies of these micronutrients might look like. If you have an iron deficiency, you're gonna have stunted plant growth. The leaves will turn yellow at the edges and spread inwards. Copper deficiency, oftentimes you'll have misshapen or darker blue-green leaves. A zinc deficiency, you might have puckered or extra small leaves. A boron deficiency, you see kind of deformed looking plants or plants that have very brittle leaves. Manganese acts very much like a magnesium deficiency would. Chlorine, you rarely have too little of it. You can have too much. If you have too much, you're going to find that your plant might have brown leaf tips, or the leaves will be turning yellow and drooping. So that's what happens when there's too much chlorine. Also, there are other tests available. Like you can test for, as I said before, salt, percent of organic matter that you have in your soil, the particle size in your soil, other heavy metals besides lead, fancy things like cation exchange capacity and buffered pH. This has to do with how efficiently plants are able to take what they need from the soil, or how well plants are able to adjust to changes in the soil. If I had a vineyard, or I was a farmer, you know, doing a crop that, and this my entire livelihood depended on understanding these things, then I'd be concerned about it. But again, as hobby gardeners, you probably don't need to worry about that unless it's your jam and you love organic chemistry, and then go nuts because there's lots to learn there. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So after you get your testing results, you get recommendations for fertilizers or for amendments. And the definition of what a fertilizer is, for purposes of this discussion, is any material that's added to the soil that provides nutrients. Amendments would be anything that's added that improves aeration, drainage, structure, and the ability of the soil to hold water and nutrients. So a very common thing that you might be asked to add to your soil would be limestone, for instance. A limestone is useful because it raises the soil pH, and that's helpful in our area, considering the fact that Connecticut soils tend to trend more and more acidic over time. There's all sorts of different sources of limestone. I think dolomitic limestone is considered the best one. There's hydrated lime, quicklime, but that could really burn your plants. Some of them contain magnesium and calcium, which could be good or it could be bad. That's why you want to check to see, okay, what are my magnesium and calcium levels like? And are these added? If I already have very high levels of these, you might want to think twice before you select something like a limestone that has these added ingredients in it, because it might put the amount of those nutrients, you know, over an acceptable threshold. So now I'm going to get into, you know, if you get a recommendation, which you always do, to add some sort of fertilizer once you perform a soil test, what that actually means. So a fertilizer is basically, it comes in terms of, it's marked and labeled in terms of how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, and how much potassium, how much N, how much P, how much K it has in it. So when you go to purchase bags of fertilizer, you've seen these numbers, these series of numbers with hyphens in between. Okay, so basically if you go and you buy a bag of fertilizer and it says 5, 10, 5, it means that there's 5 pounds or 5% nitrogen per 100 pound bag. That's what a 5, 10, 5 fertilizer means, that label. Now, you could also use the 10, 20, 10, a 10, 20, 10 bag, but you'd use only half of it, because you can see there how it's the same ratio, but it's twice as much. So you'd end up only using half of that. I hope that makes sense. So we look below, cow manure. It's about 0.5, 0.25, 0.5. You can see how much more cow manure you'd have to add to you know, a plot of land that you were trying to fertilize than you would if you just bought, say, your bag of fertilizer that had 5, 10, 5, because those aren't comparable ratios there. I understand that, but I just wanted it to indicate to you, you know, that's about what something like cow manure is. All these different fertilizers have all these different percentages of N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in them. So I want to move on to, let's see, this next slide. So if 10, 0, 10 is the recommendation, and if you were, say you wanted to go with an organic fertilizer, or even if you weren't going in with an inorganic, with a synthetic fertilizer, either one would really work. But you could use 20-00 or 00-40, but you'd have to be mindful of the fact that you'd use half as much 00-40 or twice as much 20-00 in order to come up with that 10-0-10 ratio. And I hope that that's making sense. Here's a classic combination of what you might be recommended to do if you were to choose an organic fertilizing system, and you had to add nitrogen and you had to add potassium, but you weren't supposed to be adding any more phosphorus. Remember, we talked about how terrible too much phosphorus can be to the environment, to the waterways. So you could do this, but you'd have to, I mean, 12 is roughly half, right, of 22. You'd use about half of what would come with the sulfomag than you would with the blood meal. And I'll get into a little bit more like how you calculate the poundage in just a second. There is something that I wanted to mention. Obviously, there's both synthetic and organic fertilizers, slow release, fast release. Most of the time, organic fertilizers tend to be slow release, although there are definitely exceptions. A lot of times organic has fewer added nutrients. That makes sense because if it's synthetic and you can understand why these companies would want to add in some of these other things that you might need, like magnesium or calcium. But I want to just do a quick side note, a note on organic and safety and what that means. I think a lot of times people think, oh, if I use an organic fertilizer, this is going to be safe, you know, both for me and for the environment. And I just want to make sure that it's clear that just because something says organic, it's not synonymous at all with safe. I mean, think about it, you know, strychnine, arsenic, lead, those are all organic things, or can be organic things. And you're certainly not going to, you know, use in your spray bottle trying to fertilize your garden. You're not going to have any of those things in it, or, you know, I don't know what you're up to if you are trying to fertilize with that stuff. Certainly not any good. But phosphorus, you know, as I mentioned, you could have, like, phosphorus is organic. There are organic sources of phosphorus, but if you use too much of it, it's bad. It's not safe. So I just think it's important to kind of keep that in mind. Moving on to the next slide.
Hey,
Okay.
Lindsay,
Yeah.
I was just going to say, if people have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and pipe in or put something in the chat.
Sure.
Type in something in the chat and I can ask the question too.
Okay. So recommendations for fertilizers, they're given on these test result or soil test results as pounds per 1,000 square feet. And that's super important because you're going to see on our soil test results, it'll say add 60 pounds of limestone. You're not supposed to add 60 pounds of limestone to that particular area. I'll show you that in the slide that's coming up because it's less than 1,000 square feet. You have to do the math calculations on your own. So for instance, say you tested your garden and it was 250 square feet. So if your results came back for testing the soil in that 250 square foot garden, and the test results say you should be applying 8 pounds of 5-10-10 fertilizer, you only really should be applying 2 pounds because 250 is a quarter of 1,000, just as 2 is a quarter of 8. It's kind of too bad that they don't, you know, one of the questions when you can put your samples in is they're not asking you like what you know, is the square footage of what you want to treat, because I would love it if they do those calculations for me, but it's just not the way it works. So you have to be really careful because you can imagine if you're talking about, you know, 50 square feet and your recommendation is to apply fertilizer and they're saying put in 10 pounds and you dump 10 pounds in there, holy mackerel, you have way too much of all that stuff. So you just have to be smart about it. All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So this is, thank you, Jennifer, for sharing this aerial view of Old Town Hall. Can you guys see my mouse on this slide as I'm moving it around? Can you see it? Yes? Okay, good. So this here is Ridgefield Road down at the very bottom. And this is, you know, the walkway, walking up, and, you know, this would be the front entrance into the building, okay, just to sort of orient you. And like I said, we did 16 samples. We have 7 areas, and because one area we thought might have different results, we sort of divided into, 7A and 7B. I don't remember which exact one we ended up dividing, but it's along those lines. So I submitted this soil, and we got 16 results back because we got results back for what you should do if you're doing trees and shrubs and what you should do if you're doing perennials, okay? So here are the 2 areas that I picked to choose, because it would be like the biggest snooze fest ever if I went through every single result, because by and large, they're very similar, which isn't really a surprise at all. But I did pick 2 areas where there are recommendations that are being made and where the levels are kind of interesting, and there's something a little bit to talk about. So I want to move on to the next slide. So this is the results for Old Town Hall, that 7 area. So that 7 area, remember, is the area that's in the back, which is where the wildflower garden is. It's on that slope. You see again, sandy loam, very high organic matter, but the pH is low. If we were growing vegetables there, that wouldn't be so good. We'd want to raise it. However, what we're doing up there, I believe, what we're planning on continuing to do is grow wildflowers. And wildflowers, I'm assuming, are oftentimes native flowers, native to Connecticut. And so flowers that grow native to Connecticut, they like a pH that's like what soil is typically like without any human intervention in Connecticut. So, if we were going to be growing certain kinds of plants there, this number could be a problem. If we were going to put in azalea, or have some blueberry bushes, or have a lot of native flowers, I don't know for sure what the pH is on a lot of our native wildflowers. I'm sure Jackie could speak more intelligently to that, but my hunch would be that they do okay, at the very least okay, if not thrive in slightly more acidic conditions. Now, this was the lowest number of any that we had, and assuming that people over time have been treating all areas in the town hall, all areas of that property similarly, it's interesting to think, well, then why would this particular area be such a much lower pH, almost a whole point lower pH? And I think it has to do with the fact that, as I said before, that area right behind town hall is on a slope. So I would imagine that there's a lot of just runoff. People might put amendments, might put new soil, might put compost down, what have you. And it just is naturally going to follow the line of gravity and, kind of slough off essentially. So that's my guess as to why, that pH might have been lower. So
Lindsay?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Jennifer. What about the trees around there? It seemed to have bigger trees around. Could that be affecting the soil?
That's possible. I don't know for sure. I don't know. I'd have to look back at what the recommendation for trees and shrubs would be, because I wonder if the recommendations would be different for trees and shrubs there. I have that, that's one of my other 16 results. I don't have it on hand, but that would be something to look at. And
that might be something, yeah. Okay,
so
thanks.
I'm sorry. No? So if this is totally normal to have really low nitrogen right now, that's again why we're going to be asked to put 10-10-10 fertilizer in, so that we can ramp up these levels, okay? Because they're low, medium, low, medium. So, it needs a little bit more juice, so to speak. Medium, high, high. Again, I told you before that they will say to you, whoa, your calcium levels are excessive if they're excessive. If they're just listed as medium, high, or high, it's not considered to be an issue. So they do recommend putting in limestone 150 pounds. But again, this is if we want to grow, your typical perennials that need a pH that is more in the lines of around 6.5 as opposed to 5.6. So we may not want to follow this recommendation. We're going to need to figure out what is the pH, what the plants that we want to grow there, what kind of pH do they love? And we're going to want to then adjust the soil accordingly. And again, we would never, if we decided, okay, like let's aim for a more neutral soil, we would never dump 150 pounds of limestone there, because I don't believe that's an area of 1,000 square feet. I don't know for sure, but you know, when we do these amendments, we do need to make sure that we are measuring before we actually apply anything, so that we're sure we're getting the ratios correctly. So it's recommended that we do this spring and then in July as well, because obviously that's like halfway through the growing season, and plants can oftentimes use another fertilizer boost at that point in time. Moving on to the
Lindsay?
shrubs.
About the fertilizer amount, the
Mhm.
bottom, is that actually then the rate? 15, I thought it said 15 pounds before. 15 pounds per every 100 square feet? Is that
1,000.
1,000?
1,000.
So it's actually the fertilizer rate.
I mean, these get to be like kind of mathy questions, and I'm much more of a humanities girl. So I guess the best way I'd answer that is they're telling you to put 15 pounds of this ratio of fertilizer if you are treating 1,000 square feet.
Right.
So
Okay.
say we're treating 500 square feet, we're going to put down 7.5 pounds. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does.
Okay. So then this is the other one that I thought was a little bit interesting. This is that area that was, if you're facing Town Hall, it's kind of just on the side off to the right. And let me click back to that for just a second. See where 2 is? We talked about 7, that's where 2 is. So again, sandy loam, high, but you see this pH is so much, it's really different. 5.6 to 6.3 is pretty significant. Similar in terms of, you know, the fact that we need more fertilizer here. Somewhat worse levels. My guess for why this soil might be a little bit more depleted than the other one is because there seems to be a lot more growing there at present. The area of the wildflower garden, there just seemed to be a lot of spots that, you know, they didn't really have a whole lot going on. So I think that that's why that particular area, the soil might be that much more depleted. So there, the way to fix the pH, they probably want to bump it up a little bit more, closer to 7, because again, the soils trend acidic in Connecticut. They're recommending 60 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And then they're saying, don't worry about any fertilizer now. We'll do fertilizer, you know, or don't do it now, meaning when we first submitted these, which was back in, these results came back in December. Don't put anything down now, but in April, this is when you're going to want to put, in the spring, this is what you're going to want to put down. So that is the end of, you know, any slides or formal material that I have to present. And I'd be very happy to answer any questions, and I can come back to face you, or I could stay on these slides for a bit if you want to ask any particular questions on the slides. So just let me know what you think, any questions you have, and, you know, I'll do my best to answer it or suggest where you might find the right answers for it.
Lindsay, this is
Yeah.
Janer. Doesn't
Janer.
the expression, hi dearie, the expression organic really also refer to carbon-based?
Right.
So there's a fusion sometimes between organic gardening, where you're very keen on not using pesticides and things like that, and organic from a chemistry point of view, which means it's carbon-based. So there is some confusion there.
Yeah, and I also think too, there's confusion because, you know, organic is used as a marketing term, or it's sort of, I guess, manipulated in marketing, because I think people have associations with organic being, you know, healthier.
Safer.
So there's a mystique, shall we say, to organic, and so I think that there's, you know, another level of why that word can be potentially problematic if you don't really know the science behind it. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Lindsay, I have a question.
Sure.
Actually, I have 2 questions. The first one is for the limestone application. If you're going to put that down, when's the best time to do that?
Oh, that's a good question. What I would say, in my first part of the soil testing thing that I was talking about, I did answer the question when. And you can really test your soil anytime, and you can really put that stuff down anytime. As a gardener myself who likes to have a nice vegetable garden, and I'm planning on my growing season being spring, summer, early fall, I think the best time is to test late November once everything's winding down, get your results December before the ground freezes, put that stuff in, you know, potentially fertilizer if that's recommended, certainly your limestone to adjust the pH at that time, because it sort of gives the soil an opportunity to acclimate, so to speak. I would say that there is definitely different schools of thought as to how you add fertilizers and you add amendments like a limestone. The reason why I say there's different schools of thought is some people believe that it should really just be topical and let the water carry it down, or just scratched in. Other people prefer to kind of really dig it in, maybe 6 to 12 inches down into the soil. The people that say, oh, don't do that, it's amazing what soil, it's like what's going on down there in the dirt in terms of the insects and the particles. And I mean, it's just like a galaxy, like a whole world or worlds in your soil. So when you're digging it up and you're turning it over, you're really kind of breaking down or destroying a lot of those structures that have been created that are good structures to have. So I just would recommend reading up on actually how you'd apply it. But if I got a recommendation to do this, I would do it, you know, like I said, December before the ground freezes, so we'd be good to go in the spring. But my understanding is you could really do it anytime.
Okay, great. And you might have answered this, but how long does it take for the test to come back, test results?
Oh, it totally depends on time of year. You know, I mean, a lot of times people get going in the spring and they're like, oh boy, I really should know like what I should put in my garden. And a lot of times early spring can be a really busy time, so it might take maybe 3 weeks. I got this stuff back in about 10 days. I usually get it back in about, you know, a week, week and a half, because I usually submit, I have a raised bed vegetable, flower garden. I test the soil, as I said, end of November, and I have it by, you know, mid-December. So I'm able to do the stuff before, you know, before the new year.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sure.
Lindsay, this is great. If you're done with your screen share, you might put that off, and then we can see everybody and see you better.
Sure. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that.
Should be down on the bottom there someplace.
Yeah.
If you can't, it's not a big deal.
Okay. That doesn't help, does it?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So
You're swimming now.
Nice. It's Jackie. You had mentioned before about the pH for blueberries and azaleas.
Mm-hmm.
Blueberries like really acidic soil, like 4.
Yeah.
4.0. And the ericaceous plants like rhodies and azaleas like between 5 and 6.
Okay. Now, Jackie, what about, you know, your native wildflowers? What do they like?
I don't know. I'd have to look it up. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would hazard the guess that they like it more acidic because they've evolved to, you know, where they're working in concert with what the natural pH of Connecticut soil tends to be, but I don't know that for sure. And we all know that some plants are very flexible. They can handle really wide ranges. They might be an ideal pH, but they can handle really wide ranges, whereas there are some plants that you really need to find that sweet spot. They're much less flexible that way.
They also may be growing under trees that like oaks and pine trees where they're going to be in a very acidic situation.
Absolutely true. And that's one reason why when you get recommendations on what to add for fertilizers, you also have to be careful because some fertilizers can alter the pH. So you just need to be aware of what you're putting in to the ground, because it doesn't help anyone if you get your soil tested, it's right at the pH you want, but you choose a fertilizer that has an extremely low or high pH, because that's going to obviously skew your the pH that you think is ideal. It's going to change it in the process of trying to add those nutrients to your soil.
One other thought that I had is that it's really not a good idea to add nutrients that will stimulate growth around August, because at that point you want to harden off the plants rather than encouraging them to put out new shoots or leaves.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that's why in the test results, it, you know, will often say April, that's when you want to add. July, that's when you want to add. You know, they're saying that regardless of the month that you're turning in this soil test, you know, they're giving you that recommendation for exactly what you just said, Jackie.
Lindsay, it's Jennifer again. We had added lime to our lawn, and they said it takes a while for it actually. You shouldn't retest right away. You should wait a while to retest. How long? What is the recommended time to?
It would totally depend on the kind of lime that they, you know, advocated putting down, because I don't know if it was synthetic or organic. I don't know if it was dolomitic lime or, you know, quick lime. I mean, my guess is it's probably not quick lime. It's probably dolomitic lime. But I don't know what that time would be. And the best thing to do is find out from that, you know, turf company, you know, what kind of lime did you use, and at what point, you know, is this considered to be absorbed? Because that's going to totally depend on the kind of lime that you're using.
Right. Okay.
And if it's not lime, if it's something else that's being used to make your soil more alkaline, of course, that's going to change the rate at which it's absorbed too. So it's not like anything you add in to make something more alkaline, it's all going to be absorbed at the same rate. It's all going to be different depending on what it is.
Right. Where do you buy your supplies?
Well, because I test my soil for my vegetable garden, because I do test, I do grow things that I eat. I do go with more organic options, and I'll, you know, go to places like Copia or Gilberti's or, you know, Plantone. I think you've probably heard of that brand. You know, I'll look for that sort of thing. And again, I you know, caution you, and I have to always caution myself, like, just because it says organic on the bag, it means a lot of different things. So you just have to, you know, keep that in the back of your mind. I will also test, and I mentioned this in my first video that I did, I've had chickens before, and chickens, when they're, you know, let outside of their coop, they love to peck around. They'll eat, you know, little yummy insects that they find in the lawn. And of course, those insects have been digging through your soil. And if there's lead in your soil, and I live in a 1860 house, so I'm sure at one point in time, lead paint was used to paint this house. And I just wanted to be sure that I wasn't letting my chickens loose on a plot of land that had lead in it, because that would be really bad. They eat the you know, insects that have been processing the soil that has the lead in it, and then they're laying eggs that me and my family are eating. Not good if those are full of lead. So I also will have to, when I get those soil tests for the area where my chickens hang out, I will oftentimes need to try to have the grass grow back, because they really do a number on your grass, especially if you kind of move them around your yard. And so a lot of, like, you can buy like limestone, dolomitic limestone at like chicken feed stores, like an Agway. So that's like another place where I get supplies. Agway will have, you know, a lot of that kind of stuff as well.
I'm getting spots of moss in certain areas, it seems, lately. Do you have any idea of that, or just get it tested? Because I have one little spot in my garden. I took it all away and I reseeded. I got grass, and now the moss is back.
Yeah, you know, I've heard rumors that, oh, if you have moss, it means you have alkaline soil or acidic soil. I don't know what those rumors are, but my best guess, my best recommendation to you would be to get the soil tested. I have moss in my garden sometimes too, and my guess is that we've had a really rainy spring, and we had a really rainy spring last year, and so you know, those conditions I think are just more conducive to it. It tends to clear up once we get later in the season, once everything starts to dry out a little bit more. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, okay. I also have little spots of it on the lawn in one area, so too, I don't know.
Well, one great thing to do, there's
And under the trees, I have a lot of area that has trees.
Yeah.
Grass will grow over it, but
Well, if you want to get some really good advice, the Bartlett Arboretum, and I don't know what they're doing because of COVID right now, but during the growing season months, they have what's called a plant clinic, and you can go in or you can write to them, and master gardeners that staff the clinic, there's 2 or 3 of them there over the course of, I don't know, like 9 to 4 o'clock, Monday through Friday, starting in like, I don't know, mid-May to mid-September, say. And you can bring in samples of insects or plants that aren't doing so hot, or just call them up or email them with any of these kinds of questions. And if they don't know, or if they have suspicions, but they're not totally sure, they'll do a great job researching these things for you. And they can point you in the right direction and get you hooked up with really great materials that will answer all these questions for you. I mean, I think the big secret to, knowing a lot of these things is really just knowing where to find the answers, because there's just so much stuff out there. One of the websites that I showed had a frequently asked questions page, and it also had kind of like fact sheets, I think it was called. I really recommend looking at those, because I bet a lot of the questions you've posed here are written about far more articulately in response to some of these questions. So I would really highly recommend that you, look at those websites and poke around at some of those fact sheets, because you might get to the bottom of some of these questions that way.
okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, any other questions?
It was a very nice presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you, Lindsay. It was great.
This was great.
It was awesome.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you for staying with me the whole hour. I know it's not the most exciting thing.